Hello, welcome to Voices for Justice. My name is Sharon Racusin. The focus of this show is to give voice to all the social, economic, and environmental justice work that's being done in the Upper Valley, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and to highlight how each issue is connected to the other. Ultimately, I'd like to promote the need to work together for the common good, for our human rights, and for the planet. At the end of each episode, there will be some contact information, and I urge you to get involved. Enjoy the show. Welcome to today's episode. In the studio with me today is Jeff Gardner from the Upper Valley Affinity Group. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk about what the Upper Valley Affinity Group does, and I'm going to let Jeff speak to that because I don't have the information. Go ahead.
Well, maybe I should talk a little about how I first even knew that there was an Upper Valley Affinity Group, and that goes all the way back, I believe, to January of 2014. Very, very cold night. Not long before that, I had signed, as many people did, probably hundreds of thousands of people did, I had signed the Credo Pledge against the KXL pipeline. And what we pledged when we signed that was that we would take any steps necessary to stop that, short of violence, of course.
That's the Keystone XL pipeline.
The Keystone XL pipeline. And so I went to this demonstration at the Green in Stratford, and I ran into a very good friend of mine, Nina Swaim, who unfortunately died just a while ago, a year ago. And she was excited to see me. We hadn't arranged this at all. I went by myself. She had come by herself. And she introduced me to Stuart Blood, saying, Jeffrey and Stuart, you ought to know each other. Stuart has started this group, an affinity group, of people who have signed the KXL Credo Pledge. And I thought, great. And then soon after that, in March, my partner and I in Philadelphia were arrested at the federal building blocking the doors over the KXL pipeline with a very, very large number of people. So at that point, I was set to go, and we began meeting, and that was our issue. The KXL pipeline should not be permitted, and we were dedicated to doing civil disobedience to stop it. And our focus from the beginning was TD Bank, and TD Bank in Montpelier. And the reason we were focused on TD Bank is that it was a huge investor in TransCanada, which owned the KXL pipeline and was building the KXL pipeline. And very quickly we came to realize that not only was TD involved in TransCanada, which was KXL, but also the state of Vermont kept at that time about 70% of its operating budget, its unrestricted funds, in TD Bank. That's where the revenues that came into the state were kept, and that's where the outflow of money, everything that the state pays for, was. And that banking at that point, and probably it's about the same now, cost taxpayers about $750,000 every year just in bank fees. And so that's why we were focused on TD Bank and TD Bank investing, as we like to say, in climate disaster, and also investing in the Dakota Access Pipeline.
And so Vermont is still invested in TD Bank.
It still keeps its operating budget in TD Bank, its unrestricted funds, and the thing about it is that now, it used to be about 70% of those funds were in TD Bank. Now it's almost all.
Wow.
And I'm not quite, and we just learned that recently, I'm not sure exactly how and why that shifted around, but it's much more than it used to be.
So once Keystone Pipeline was prevented from crossing the Canadian-American border, that's what happened, right? President Obama prevented that from happening. Right. You shifted your focus.
I wouldn't say we really shifted our focus. Our focus did change somewhat I think we also saw from the beginning that TD Bank and the state were kind of partners in the Vermont Gas Pipeline, because TD is not just invested in TransCanada, but it's invested in the other huge fossil fuel transport corporation, which is called Enbridge, also a Canadian corporation. And Enbridge owns Gaz Metro in Montreal, and it's Gaz Metro, another huge company that owns Vermont Gas and owns Green Mountain Power. And it's Vermont Gas Systems, VGS as we call it, that is building the pipeline down from Williston to Middlebury, which is almost complete. So as early as October of 2014, groups in central Vermont called for a huge demonstration at the governor's office just before, it was just 2 weeks before the last time Governor Shumlin was elected. And we actually flooded into the Pavilion building, and we flooded some of us into his office, the rest of us into the main lobby of the building, and stayed there for hours until a very large number of us, I think it was 62 people, were arrested. And eventually those charges were dropped. And that's sometimes the way we're treated by the police in Montpelier and in the state. Our sense is that the state has not wanted a lot of bad publicity, to say the least, about the pipeline. It's had full-voiced and full-bodied support of state government, and I don't think they're particularly proud of that, because there's been so much feeling against it. But that always has been a focus of ours. And I think that when KXL was not permitted by the federal government, we went more in the direction of the Vermont Gas Pipeline and protesting and working against that with many other groups.
Where does that stand now?
Well, where that stands is that it's kind of at a stalemate. The pipeline is built all the way from Middlebury to Jabrag's Park in Heinsberg, and it's built all the way down from Williston to Jabrag's Park in Heinsberg. And there are about, I don't know, maybe 200 yards that need to be complete, and then that line will be finished. And that is being held up because the Public Service Board, the agency that grants certificates of public good, although this is not in the public interest at all,
Not at all.
has granted the right of eminent domain to Vermont Gas Systems. And that was contested, vigorously contested by a citizens group in Heinsberg, and they lost. The right of eminent domain was granted, the property and the nomenclature was condemned, and that decision of the Public Service Board was appealed to the state Supreme Court. And that means that automatically a stay on construction was imposed. And of course, Vermont Gas immediately asked the court to lift that stay. And this is now 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, and the court has not lifted the stay. The company has not been able to build. They claim that they're losing, I think their number is $750,000 a day. And we don't know whether the court or when the court will or won't lift that stay of construction. And we have no idea how the court will rule on that. We certainly hope that the court sees it our way and thinks that the pipe should not cross the wetland through that park. And there are a lot of issues involved there.
Right.
So we'll see what happens.
So that's, no pun intended, that's a good segue to, there was a hold, stay on that connection.
Yep.
And now the whole Dakota Access Pipeline erupted.
Right.
And so let's move on to that. And
sure.
And you've been very involved in the protests at TD Bank in Montpelier.
Right. And one thing that's interesting about that is that the situations, although hugely different in scale, I mean, Dakota Access Pipeline being built by Energy Transfer Partners is an 1,100-mile pipeline project, and it's oil, not gas. we're talking about 41 miles of gas pipeline in Vermont. So the scales are hugely different. But the interesting thing is that the pipeline, in the Dakota Access Pipeline, is built all the way from the Bakken oil fields, fracking fields, in North Dakota down to Cannonball River, the Oahe Lake. And then it continues on the other side of the river all the way out to Illinois. There are some sections that aren't completely built that are being contested primarily by farmers in Iowa. Mm-hmm. But the situation in both cases is you have publicly owned land that has not been permitted as an area for the pipeline to cross, both in North Dakota and here in Vermont. And that is an interesting similarity between the two. And interesting too is that there never really was any kind of full environmental review of our little pipeline, which for the people who live along it is no little thing, and in terms of climate consequences is no little thing. But again, in terms of scale, it's much smaller than North Dakota. And that pipeline was built segment by segment by segment, with towns and counties permitting it all the way through. And there never was a full-scale environmental review, and that's what has stopped it there just in the last few days. Mm-hmm. The Army Corps of Engineers has said, no right of eminent domain, we won't grant you an easement to cross the river until there is a full-scale environmental review.
And just to be clear, I mean, there are a lot of people who are very happy about this permit the easement not being granted. Mm-hmm. But there really isn't anything to celebrate in the bigger picture, because this isn't the only pipeline being built.
Oh no!
This is not the probably the best thing we could say about this easement not being granted is that the Standing Rock Sioux were able to win this battle.
Yes.
Which is in itself a tremendous victory for the native people.
Right. And it is a huge victory, and it's a victory worth celebrating. But from our point of view, Upper Valley Affinity Group, other environmental groups in Vermont, but most importantly for the people of Standing Rock themselves, for the native people, that victory is only a partial one, even if it is ultimately successful, because the idea is that pipeline will be rerouted somewhere else. But neither they, who live in Standing Rock, nor we here in Vermont want that pipeline or any new pipeline to be built at all. It's absolutely the wrong direction, and a direction we can't afford to go in for many, many reasons. Mm-hmm. The biggest, obviously, is climate change.
Climate change, right. So that, I'd like to stop there, if you don't mind. And is there any other information that you think that the public might want to know about the state of Vermont's complicity in supporting dirty fossil fuel?
Well, I think the key here is that all of these things are really connected. TD Bank was invested in KXL. TD Bank is invested in Enbridge Gas Metro and the Vermont Gas Pipeline here. But TD Bank is also one of the biggest of the 17 banks, Canadian and America, who have money in, and a huge amount of money in, the Dakota Access Pipeline. So once again, in that same way, the state of Vermont, keeping all of its funds, banking through TD Bank, is in that particular way supporting the Dakota Access Pipeline, because it's supporting TD Bank. And we would like to see that end. We would like the state of Vermont not to do its banking at TD and find a worthwhile alternative to that. Right.
And just for the public to know, symbolically, we're asking people to withdraw their money, and I think there are alternative banks. You were talking about a public bank. That's a state public bank. But TD Bank, Bank of America, Citibank, Barclays, Wells Fargo, Bank of Nova Scotia, Chase Bank, SunTrust, UBS, and Citizens Bank.
It's a catalog of ignominy.
each of these banks have something like $130 million invested in energy transfer.
Oh, it's much more than that.
And this is something I pulled off of the web. It might have been old, but
no, TD Bank alone, I think the number is 395 billion, a million rather, and the total for the project is over 3 billion.
Right.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
And there were recently many protests outside of TD Bank in Montpelier.
Yep.
There was some civil disobedience each time. And
the end of September, perhaps something like 100 people and a very large troupe from the Bread and Puppet Theater marched from City Hall down to the bank and right into the bank where Bread and Puppet performed an anti-bank program. And I think it was about a month later, early in November on a Saturday, something like 75 to 100 people gathered at the smaller branch of TD Bank and then walked down to the larger one. And I think people are eager to have our materials about this. They've heard something about this TD Bank connection, and it's something that they don't like to hear. And so when we have flyers to hand out, people eagerly, in stop traffic that we've stopped, roll down their windows and put their hands out to get our flyers. And then November 15th, we actually turned out something like 200 to 250 people for a rally right at the bank. And then just this last Monday, as part of the nationwide call for action in support of the people of Standing Rock, we had again, despite really awful weather that morning, just this last Monday morning, we had something like 200 people in the street. 10 people went into the bank, they locked the doors, 2 people came out, 8 people were arrested. We had people sitting at the inside doors, the side that we couldn't get through, ready to block those, but the bank closed for the day. They're also down the street at the smaller branch. 10 college students had locked in so that they blocked the drive-through lanes there. That branch was also closed. And I would say something around 70 or 80, maybe a little more, of us stayed through the day just to make sure that the bank was closed all day long. And it was a wonderful day of visible and vocal advertising about just how bad TD Bank is and how the state ought to get its money out as a climate change issue, but also as an economic and environmental justice issue.
Right. So let's stop there. I'm going to have you come back.
Great.
We're going to talk about climate change
Great.
and the alternatives to both banking and green energy. So thank you, Jeff,
Thank you.
for having
Glad to be
for
here.
being on the show, and I'll speak to you shortly.
Great.